The fate of Donald Trump's former chief strategist Steve Bannon is now in the hands of a federal jury in Washington, D.C. Jurors started their deliberations about 2 hours ago after both sides delivered closing arguments. Just before those closing arguments began, Bannon's team raised questions about audio of Bannon that was played during last night's January 6th committee hearing, saying it was of a particularly inflammatory nature. Bannon was charged with contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with a subpoena from that committee. NBC News Justice correspondent Ryan Riley joins us from outside the federal courthouse in Washington. Ryan, what are we looking at? What's going on? I think a lot of people felt when there was no defense presented, this might come lightning fast, but we're still waiting.
Yeah, I mean, they have to pick a foreman first, right? So I think that they have to have lunch, but I wouldn't expect this to go for an extremely long time today, just because, like you said, it's a pretty spaghetti on the wall defense from Bannon's team here. There's not a lot that they were actually allowed to argue. They weren't allowed to argue advice of counsel. They weren't allowed to argue that Steve Bannon was just simply following the advice of his lawyer. And the Justice Department, federal prosecutors are making this out to be a very simple, straightforward case. They actually compared it to parking tickets in D.C., which are pretty notorious, and said, listen, when you get a ticket, you can either contest it or you can pay it. And if you don't do either, then it doubles. And that's sort of the metaphor that they laid out for jurors here, and try to keep this as simple and straightforward as a case as possible. I mean, in the long term here, it was sort of obvious that Steve Bannon's defense team has been setting this up for an eventual appeal. I think that's going to come shortly thereafter. But it's a pretty straightforward case, and it seems like something that we could hear back from the jury as soon as today on, Chris.
And potentially, if he's convicted, Bannon could go to jail?
That's right. Yeah. So there's actually a 30-day mandatory minimum in this case. It could go up to a year, but even if he was just convicted on one of those charges, it's a 30-day minimum. So no flexibility for anything else, any probation or anything in that category. So that's what he's looking down. He could exhaust those appeals, and they could take a little bit more time. He might be able to kick this out, but he can't really kick the can down the road forever on this one.